Hello, we are live. Okay, marvelous. So, the subject of this video is pretty self-explanatory. It's to unpack everything that is wrong with Restore Britain, in my view, and to explain why I can't support or be a part of it. It's a great shame, to be honest, because like many people similar to me who lean left on economics but right on culture, I've been searching for a patriotic, less austerity-orientated conservative movement to get behind and be involved in for years. One of the last things I wanted to see emerge was another form of Thatcherism, let alone one washed down with anachronistic aesthetic showcasing a version of Britain that looks more like something you'd find in Studio Ghibli or Columbia from Bioshock Infinite than Britain as it has ever really existed. Well, this, unfortunately, is what we have with Restore Britain. My disappointment isn't just related to the poor optics or the theoretical flaws of the political project itself, which I will explain in this video. It extends to how distastefully some of Rupert Lowe's chosen people have behaved since the party was launched, despite being placed in positions of authority above those far more experienced and qualified than themselves. I'm seriously worried by their motivations, the sorts of characters they seem to be drawing to the party, and most importantly, perhaps, whether Rupert is even in charge at this point. I haven't made these judgments just from watching and listening to the campaign since the launch of the party. I've been paying attention to the noises coming out of the associated events, meetings, and conferences for a while, and there are honestly so many things wrong that it is not only destined to be politically counterproductive to the end of restoring anything in Britain, but it is also at risk of making a lot of those involved look quite silly and potentially ruin the careers of the councillors and MPs who decide to defect, whether now or in the future. I've narrowed down the weaknesses to 4 key areas. The first concerns the philosophy, the second concerns the policies, the third concerns the people, the fourth concerns the strategy. And let's begin with the first weakness, the philosophy. This is the most consequential weakness in the long run if we're to judge Restore Britain by the obvious disjunction between the policies you'll find on the official website and how it has marketed itself since it was officially launched as a political party. There is a complete absence of a cohesive political philosophy, in short. I can imagine some arguing in response that the phrase "Restore Britain" is self-explanatory, but it's not. And the social media optics, which we'll go into a bit more later, demonstrate just how shallow and confused the party's conception, whatever, of restoration is. Some of you may be wondering, of course, whether having a cohesive philosophy matters. But in the case of Restore Britain, it really does, because it's proposing something quite radical, if not revolutionary. And yes, that word has been used by its official spokespeople. If there's no big idea behind how Britain is going to be restored, then what does Restore Britain mean? Now, it's true that neither of the two largest political parties, namely Labour and the Conservatives, operates under a single underlying philosophy. They're better understood these days as big tent political organisations composed of different people and lobby groups competing internally to achieve a similar end. But that only works for them because they've been established for a long time, relatively speaking. The success of reform, like UKIP a decade or so ago, has been built on providing a political home for those who have been pushed out of the modern Conservative Party's big tents due to having concerns about immigration and the cancer operating under the name of diversity, equity and inclusion, for example. that were too strong for the mainstream Big C Conservatives. In terms of policy, Restore Britain is remarkably similar, if not identical, to Reform in some areas. So, in order to make any impression on the current political climate, it has to be more than a Rupert Lowe fan club and actually offer something that Reform isn't already. Restore could have done this if it backed up its policies with a solid and cohesive political and moral philosophy. It could have put itself in the position of saying, yeah, okay, we're not that dissimilar from Reform policy-wise, given that Reform is literally where we sprung from. However, what distinguishes us from the modern-day Tory Party 2.0 that Reform is that everything that we're offering is a reflection of who we are, the sort of government we aspire to be, and the sort of country we want to pass on to future generations. In other words, we are people of serious conviction. Our policies are not just crowd pleasers that we include just to score points of some kind, but things that we believe in and will thus implement effectively. Maybe I was just hopefully optimistic, but I hoped that having a more robust code of conduct on how people and politicians should treat each other was built into the Restore fabric, given that the project itself started with Rupert being stabbed in the back by the Reform leadership. I thought this could give rise to a more sincere, grassroots Conservative movement. Regrettably, however, Restore has only managed to do a single thing right since its party launch, and that is to identify that it has to evolve into something more than a Rupert Lowe fan club. The marketing and messaging on the early campaign trail, however, has been disorganised, poorly thought out, and in some cases quite embarrassing, as unfortunately demonstrated by Charlie through his appearance on Alex Phillips's Talk TV show. This, I'm afraid, is inexcusable and entirely the result of a lack of preparation and political consultation, which matters when you want to get elected. I mean, you would think that having decided to adopt some form of ethno-nationalism as an alternative to Reform's civic post-racialism and had months to discuss the details of what ethnicity and being British amount to among themselves, well, you'd have thought that they'd have established a firm definition of what it means to be ethnically British in contrast with what it means to be ethnically English, but clearly that went amiss. We'll get onto that a bit more later. Right, so the second weakness, which is maybe the least consequential, the policies, because the policies are not all bad. In fact, many of them are good. So, deporting illegal immigrants, in principle, good, and they've gone to much greater lengths than Reform to explain how they would do it, which is all the better. Reversing the Boris wave, pretty much the same as the first, in principle good, for as long as the people they're deporting are indeed unemployed or scrounging and not providing an essential service that we can't be without. Doing what's required to have a functioning border, in other words, leaving the ECHR. I'd rather not leave the ECHR, but if there's no way of amending the legislation to actually uphold a country's right to sustain its parent culture, then I guess leaving is our only option. Restoring town centres across the UK, and in particular investigating the cause of the barbershop/nail salon and vape shop epidemic. In principle, good, as almost all of our town centres have turned into tacky shitholes composed of businesses that are almost certainly fronts for washing drug money or worse. Using the state to engender more hospitable conditions for people to have families and get married. This is excellent because this social structure is fundamental to the renewal of the high trust civil society. We should want that. Defunding the BBC. I find this personally regrettable because I like much of what the BBC produces, not least Match of the Day, but its unwavering commitment towards, well, whatever you want to call it, makes it necessary at this point. Having our courts recognise the right to self-defence. Yes, we should be protecting the victims of crime, not persecuting them for defending themselves. I think this could be a good and effective deterrent to burglaries, for example. Abolishing inheritance tax. Inheritance is already taxed as income is accumulated. It shouldn't be taxed twice. At this point, it amounts to nothing more than class warfare against the middle class, if I'm being honest. Inheritance tax doesn't really affect the upper class as much as people seem to think, obviously due to having significantly higher access to wealth management services. Repealing the draconian censorship legislation that allows the CPS, Crown Prosecution Service, to imprison people for tweeting when violence isn't incited. I think that goes without saying. Having an independent inquiry into the COVID-19 vaccines. This would be an excellent opportunity to decipher whether the more adventurous claims being made are the result of conspiracy theories or not, or a part of a conspiracy, or whatever. It would just clear up a lot of the stuff that's being suspiciously brushed under the carpet. Reforming the postal voting system to thwart coercive block voting. Well, this is absolutely essential because it's a serious problem right now, and that's only going to get worse if we don't intervene. Using tents rather than hotels for asylum seekers, that would be most likely be an effective deterrent. Infrastructure first housing policy. Now, this is very important. Okay, many of these new developments, I've seen a lot of them myself, there are too many awful looking houses and blocks of flats and not enough shops, community centres, schools or doctors' surgeries, hardly any in some cases. You can't have a community or the most basic of social lives without said infrastructure. Okay, so that's it for the good. But before getting on to the bad, there are several policies that I've put in the undecided category. Now, Restore's policy on the NHS seems sensible and is certainly more promising than reforms, but it's extremely lacking in detail, so I'm suspending judgment on that. Abolishing net zero. Okay, I simply don't have the scientific knowledge to have an informed opinion about whether subjecting consumers to higher energy prices to reduce carbon emissions is ethically justified or not. And to be honest, neither do most of the people who talk about it quite loudly, to be brutally honest. So I'm going to abstain from weighing in on something I know little about, if not absolutely nothing. Repealing the Online Safety Act. I'll be honest with you, I like what the current government is trying to do in principle, I should stress, to protect children from harmful or explicit online content, because let's face it, a lot of parents these days are useless at monitoring what their children are doing, and there are social consequences to that. In an ideal world, yes, it should be the remit of the parents to control what content their children can watch, but that isn't the world we're living in at the moment. The family institution has taken a lot of damage, and it's taken a lot of damage over the last few decades, and unfortunately that's going to require more from the states in order to protect children and nullify the social consequences of bad parenting. That said, I'm also acutely aware, yes, that there are many potential alternative motives behind this legislation, which is by no means limited to policing what adults can watch under the umbrella of harmful misinformation. Now, on to the bad. While I'm generally on board with the idea of remigration, because the changes that this country has succumbed to in this millennium amounts to a social and moral crime that our politicians had no right or mandate to subject us to. The inclusion of the term human rights in quotation marks on the Restore Britain policy page, however, could be interpreted to imply that the party has something of an intention to pull away from the persisting post-war consensus based on the international recognition of natural law. Indeed, the quotation marks could instead be referring to the extent to which the term human rights has been obfuscated and assumed a nominal status, given that everyone seems to be legally citing it. Who wants to get away with due punishment? But look, if that's the point, then if so, I readily agree. However, the party's brief statement on foreign policy, found under the heading "Put British interests first," reads as excessively isolationist. Now, there is, of course, nothing wrong with prioritising your nation's interests over others. In fact, that's a functional prerogative of being a nation state. But pulling away from every single international convention solely on the formal basis that they come from outside is reckless and counterproductive and will increase the likelihood of conflicts in the future. Having, in my opinion, and this isn't just my opinion, it's the educated opinion of many, having international law and order is a good thing and a practical condition for national security. It's something that pretty much any intelligent person recognizes. But the matter of contention is the thing that we should be discussing is what the terms of international cooperation should be. It doesn't have to be the so-called globalist one that Blair and the European Union of old were aggressively pursuing. And in the world as it currently exists, we cannot be without political and economic alliances. So rather than cast ourselves away, we need to remain outward-looking and look to forge new alliances in terms of engagement as an independent nation with other independent nations. Equally concerning to me, however, the assertions displayed in their plans to rebuild Britain's industry, infrastructure, and energy security. Now, Restore appears to have chosen to run with the low-resolution reading of the housing issue, housing crisis, whatever you want to call it. Hence its proliferation of the view that young people are being priced out of home ownership because of immigration and red tape. I'm not denying that red tape and immigration add to the problem, in some cases exponentially, but it's economically illiterate and frankly dishonest to overlook the factor of rentierism or landlordism. Houses are expensive because they've evolved in great part to be buy and hold investments as well as homes, with the growing demand for housing caused by, indeed, immigration, certain of perpetually strengthening the hand of the property-owning class. If you want to know why so many big C conservatives are big on deregulation and low taxes, but weirdly liberal on immigration, this is one of the more compelling reasons why. So cutting down on immigration regulation and administering mass deportations will not solve the problem of inflating house prices. Affordable housing can only be achieved with the input of, on some, or at least on some level, protectionism, as in stopping foreign investors from buying properties and gaining stakes in housing development projects, and preventing property from being a portfolio asset for people who already have homes in the first place. Now, I understand that Restore is going to do something on the front of preventing foreign investors from buying out homes to then house foreigners, etc. That's obviously good, but I still think they need to address the issue of housing being a portfolio asset, because that is the most, I would say, detrimental factor in why housing is just so unaffordable. Right. So moving on to their energy policy. Now, I agree that Britain should live off and own its own energy supply. But if we're insisting on doing that by extracting shale gas, then you have to accept that that comes with considerable risks to the environment. Returning to fossil fuels may be necessary for now, given that net zero isn't sustainable for other reasons, but we simply cannot have long-term energy security without either an infinite supply of fossil fuels, which we don't have, nobody has, or some form of hybrid system that includes renewables to at least minimize our reliance on unsustainable sources. Investing in nuclear energy while putting renewables on a back burner, no pun intended, seems to be the best compromise. By the way, I am aware that Restore has published a statement concerning their official energy philosophy just a few days ago. At first glance, it looks like a step in the right direction, but until I read more, that's all I can say on it. Okay, here's an interesting one: automating the tube. Now, I'm being a little bit speculative here, but I feel compelled to at least entertain the speculation. This is potentially the most counterproductive of their policies, and is arguably an example of the short-sighted Thatcherism I referred to earlier as well. But in all honesty, I'm less worried about the policy itself and more about the precedent that it sets. So Restore's marketing team, presumably as part of an attempt to make the party more appealing to younger generations, or perhaps to express their own fantasies, maybe, to give form to their own fantasies, is to create and sustain an association between the political climate in the UK and the fantasy world of Lord of the Rings, involving Restore Britain being the party of the Shire, with Mordor representing, again, they haven't stated this explicitly, I'm being a bit speculative, Mordor representing the pathological and totalitarian emanations of modernity. Now, this would be a very powerful and useful metaphor to work with, but there appears to be a clash of messaging. If Restore Britain is prioritising efficiency and profit above employment as a general rule, then it's doing the bidding of Mordor, not the Shire, by setting a precedent for either the state or corporations further empowered by Restore's low corporation tax policy, by the way, to follow suit. Naturally, what would follow would be a national unemployment crisis and perhaps even lead to the UK being rolled back into pre-labour rights capitalism, being that the legislation that's in place to protect labour rights, human rights, would become superfluous and likely be repealed as a result. Like, both of these things would disproportionately hurt the white working class. So this oversight for me is directly linked to the absence of a cohesive political philosophy. There is absolutely no blueprint being presented for how Britain is going to be rebuilt, modernised and reindustrialised for those who would, well, the people they identify that a country is for, or in the case of the metaphor they're running with, the hobbits themselves. You can't present yourself as the party of the Shire while basing your economic policy on how you can put the hobbits out of work to save the treasury money. Anyway, so the most confusing and potentially facetious of their policies, however, concerns Restore's commitments to repatriating Christianity in Britain, and to start by increasing its presence in the national curriculum. In principle, this is a completely uncontroversial noble goal. Despite not being a practicing Christian, I totally acknowledge Britain's rich Christian heritage and, in fact, try to practice and promote all of its moral precepts whenever I can, that is, treating people and the moral law as ends in themselves, not only things to be done because they benefit me in some way. As far as I'm concerned, the moral universe of Christianity is universal, not particular, and you don't necessarily require the input of religion to act morally and be a moral person. But the problem here is twofold. First, repatriating Christianity can mean anything from turning Britain into a theocracy of the kind that it was under Oliver Cromwell's directorship of Puritans, to adopting secularism of the kind advocated by Martin Luther, where not coercing religion and the right to worship as you wish becomes a state religion almost in itself, which you'd have to extend to Muslim and non-believers as well. In short, both of these things are in complete contradiction. So unless we're going to read something more into Restore's decision to name the premium tier membership the Cromwell Club, then this is nothing more than a virtue signalling policy in the best case scenario without more detail. Second, this is where it becomes slightly worrying. If you navigate the section on education, you'll come across the phrase, "There is no such thing as a neutral institution." Now, just to clarify my position on this, that statement is 100% true in practice. The reason for that is simple. It's people who run institutions, and every person on some level has biases and blind spots, even with the best intentions. And institutions themselves have their ideological leanings in some form. And even when they try to be neutral, it's impossible to be completely robotic. So no institution can be absolutely neutral, and it's dishonest to claim, as their representatives often do, that they are functioning in such a way. However, and this is the important part, that doesn't mean we need to stop viewing neutrality as the desired standard. The very reason that our universities, the BBC, the Church of England, and the police, just to list a few examples, behave as they do, is that the political philosophies that have been allowed to reshape these institutions, intersectional feminism and critical race theory to be precise, identify the concept of neutrality as doing the secret bidding, or the explicit bidding, I should say, of white supremacy. They've both rejected neutrality and put in place a social hierarchy where, in their words, cis-het white men feature right at the very bottom because they are taken to be the incarnation of social oppression. Hence the two-tier policing and justice system that we now have in the UK. Now, I know what many of you are thinking. How does this express a problem with Restore Britain, which rightfully wants to put an end to all of that? It hasn't specified. They haven't specified whether neutrality is even desirable. In the worst case scenario, the phrase "there are no neutral institutions" is representative of a certain strategic, is representative of a, how do I put this? If you're committing to the idea that there are no neutral institutions, then you could take the view that there's no need to adhere to a standard of impartiality, which gives you a free pass to run something as you wish. I mean, in the worst possible scenario, you can interpret it as a strategic commitment to the political theology of Carl Schmitt, namely the friends-enemy distinction, which, as everyone, or at least most historians know, the adopted political philosophy and strategy of the Nazi Party. Now, look, that obviously doesn't mean in the slightest that Restore Britain is adopting Nazism. They're absolutely not doing that, I'm sure. What it does mean is that they're potentially viewing the political landscape through that friends-enemies lens. Now, anyone who understands the friends-enemies distinction will know that neither morality nor reason have any purchase within it. It amounts to an ideological rejection of universalism in favour of absolute particularism. The friends of the friends, or the interests of the friends and the friends alone. Now, this might sound, the interest of the friends and the friends alone, this might sound like a good thing for those who think that universalism is just a product of communism or the World Economic Forum, but they would be woefully misguided on both accounts. Rejecting universalism outright involves rejecting the very presumption of self-evident transcendent principles, including natural inalienable human rights. There is an implicit justification there of political nihilism, as it involves only recognising the interests of the recognised social group, that is, the friends, as legitimate, whatever the content of those interests may be, whether that group is inclined to control its borders, reintroduce smoking in pubs, or maybe bring back human sacrifice. All is fair game in the world of absolute particularism because the state gets its legitimacy from the interests of the friends. There is no mitigating force on what those interests can be. I like to think I can speak for the majority of the viewers here. I make no apology for believing that we should set ourselves higher standards than that as a movement. And personally, I'm glad to still be a part of an international political order that is generally still rational. And although in desperate need of reform, and not least because of the double standards in plain sight that I've already mentioned, continues to recognise the existence of natural law and inalienable human rights. It would be beyond reckless to abandon that, considering how bad things used to be for ordinary people in Europe, the grounds by which people were incarcerated, tortured, burned at the stake, etc. What it took for us to reach this consensus and the security guarantees that certain international agreements do still offer, I don't think we should throw that away. The problem should be perceived to lie not in rationalism per se or the recognition of human rights, as some reactionaries argue, but rather in the fact that history is yet to finish. This involves recognizing that we still have an inadequate grasp of rationality and an even more inadequate grasp of how those rights should be protected in practice. In my opinion, given the extent to which protecting the human rights of migrant criminals has clearly encroached on the welfare and security of indigenous citizens across Western Europe in particular, this fact about the need for the reformation of international law should be recognised as self-evident. That strikes me as the sensible and pragmatic position to take on international relations. For those who explicitly hate Israel and yet also subscribe to the idea that nations shouldn't be held accountable at all by any international body, I suggest you think again about what you're actually advocating. Unfortunately, this isn't where my concerns end in this area. Equally concerning is the fact that the friends enemies distinction contains another nihilistic implication, namely that political stability is consummated by the socialized and perpetual renewal of an enemy, even if that assumes the form of a myth. In other words, looking at the political climate through Schmitt's lens involves accepting propaganda as a fact about the acquisition and retention of power. It was this that justified the Nazi Party's infamous Department of Propaganda, whereby the presentation of Jews as an irredeemably pure infinite other was judged to be a necessary condition for the creation of the German Reich that they wanted to establish for 1,000 years. But this is, of course, the most infamous and extreme example one can give of the friends enemies distinction. I want it being put into practice. I want to put that clear. But it is based on an accurate reading of Schmitt's theory. And if Restore Britain's appointed strategists are consciously adhering to it, then they might well have an infinite abject other of their own in mind. Whether this is the case or not, it is as unchristian a thing to play God with the truth. Truth in Christianity is rightfully recognized as an end in itself, not something to be disfigured at will for personal or political gain. Truth is man's guiding light amidst the adversities of life, not his obstacle. At least that's what you should believe if you're a Christian, and I stand by it, even though I'm not a practicing Christian. But that said, some self-proclaimed Christians, or more specifically Catholics, do seem to think that doing that very thing is their prerogative. Which brings me on to the third weakness of Restore Britain: the people. Now, before I begin this section properly, there are a few things I need to explain first, because this is most likely to be the decisive factor of Restore Britain's fate. In my opinion, the right in Britain has never really come to terms with why and how it got betrayed by its politicians, and betrayed to the point that it would change the country beyond recognition. The short answer is that the people who represented the electorate, which we refer to as the political class, progressively sold the electorate out, and sold the electorate out because they put their career interests before the interests of the country. They essentially felt that the post-war world was evolving in a certain direction, and that if they didn't evolve with the programme, they would get left behind. There emerged at some point in the post-war period an unstated and unidentified disjunction between the values of the general public and those of the political class, which only became abundantly clear in the wake of Enoch Powell's notorious Rivers of Blood speech in 1968. Now, whatever one's opinion of Enoch Powell and his arguably prophetic speech, he cannot be accused of being a career politician. Despite the speech turning out to be an understatement in the view of many people, giving it as good as ended his political career and stamped upon him the pariah status that persists even today. I mean, was Enoch Powell the only politician in Parliament at that time who had serious concerns about mass immigration? Almost certainly not. However, it was he who gave the speech, rather than the other 300 or so MPs who probably knew he had a point on some level, because he was made of essentially different stuff to those MPs. He had a moral backbone, unlike those around him who, while probably quietly agreeing with him, weren't willing to part with their career prospects or their reputation in front of each other in order to publicly defend him. Now, I'm pretty sure that some analysts or commentators would argue that this amounts to a failing on Enoch Powell's part, on the grounds that he could have been more pragmatic and played the political field a bit more, controlling the damage rather than making grandiose speeches, but that's all simply wrong. The painful outcomes which we live among now are not the result of Powell not being good enough at realpolitik, not least because he is only one man. It's the result of the politicians around him choosing status over principle and self-interest over country. As Peter Hitchens notoriously observes, a very similar thing happened in the early 2000s, again in the Conservative Party of all places, when a wave of young, ambitious and supposedly bright politicians, one being Liz Truss, flocked to the cause of the heir to Blair, David Cameron, because they wanted jobs in the cabinet more than they wanted to uphold the moral fibre of the Conservative Party and do what was right for the country. Of course, that transformation delivered electoral success for the Conservative Party. I'm not denying that. But in terms of substance, the Conservative Party never recovered. Conservatism never recovered, even after the awakening delivered by Brexit. Now, the thing I've always hated the most about the right, aside from the nihilistic impulses of some so-called traditionalists, is this obsession, and I mean obsession, with causally attributing the West's cultural and social decline to the long march through the institutions thesis by people who, more often than not, have never read the works of any of the Frankfurt School thinkers. This has always struck me as a product of unconscious cope for the following reason. Essentially, because the idea of a small cabal of fanatics conspiring and successfully administering the subversion of every social institution and subsequently the mess that we're all living in now is less uncomfortable than coming to terms with the scale of the betrayal and the scale of the moral failing on the part of our politicians. The cultural Marxism conspiracy theory is particularly pervasive because it is in many ways quite comforting. People who like to view themselves as practicing moral agents can be absolved first of recognizing the woke, progressive, evil world they inhabit as in part the direct result of their action or inaction, and second, acknowledging that the so-called conservative internet personalities they emotionally invested into these potential solutions may be selling them out in a similar way. The second part for me is especially important because, and this is from my personal experience, there is a striking indifference among the supposedly socially conservative base to whether these so-called conservative or traditionalist online personalities practice what they preach or not. That for me exposes the sort of the rot right there. Our standards have fallen so exponentially that we no longer even expect our politicians or aspiring politicians to act morally unless they personally gain from it. By extension, if restoration is to be actionable, there first needs to be a complete reset of our political culture. So herein lies the all-important question. Is Restore Britain up to this task of resetting the political culture in Britain that would lead us to having less slimy career politicians and more politicians of conviction that will do what the people vote for them to do? From where I'm sitting, no. I'm now going to explain why. Now, the details I'm about to share, I should stress strongly, are all from my personal experience and my resultant judgment, having had time to reflect on the events. I'm open to the possibility that I've got the wrong end of the stick in some areas, because it did at one point get quite personal and nasty, and emotion naturally obscures judgment. However, I can tell you for a fact that I'm not the only person with these concerns and who has this very opinion of the people. I was just unfortunate enough to have been one of the targets, shall we say. The long and short of it is that Rupert Lowe's suspension from reform, following what does sound like a conspired political assassination attempt, essentially commissioned a social climbing rat race between several people on the GB News / Talk TV / Lotus Eaters media circuit, and those with the same educational backgrounds to the people they want to replace, who were clearly eyeing up what they saw as the career opportunity of a lifetime if they could get close to Rupert Lowe. Among those, of course, were people who saw an opportunity for the right reasons, because they were genuinely appalled by Rupert's treatment and, as such, became even more motivated to change the political culture of this country. However, others who I met in person originally thought very highly of and clearly went to great lengths to ensure that they were credited on Restore's website, turned out to be some of the most malicious, manipulative, amoral, and sociopathic people I have ever met, as evidenced in the lengths that they would go to mark their territory, which may or may not include slander. To my knowledge, none of the people I've just alluded to and won't name, sorry to disappoint the drama merchants, and I have good reason to suspect were behind some of the unauthorized Restore Britain social media accounts, perhaps they did that because they got sniffed out, given the elbow, and didn't like it. Don't know. None of them are an official part of Restore's fabric anymore, it seems. However, there are still big questions to be asked about those who are, especially those who have been granted the senior positions. So, the frontmen of this project, if you like, as in those who have been leading the media campaign trail since Restore was officially launched as a political party, are Lewis Brackpool, the Director of Investigations, Harrison Pitt, the Senior Fellow, and Charlie Downs, the Head of Political Strategy. I haven't ever met Lewis or Harrison, despite them being very close mutuals of people I'm still in touch with at the Lotus Eaters. But I have met Charlie on a few occasions. The first time I met him was alone, when he had even fewer ex-followers than I do now. We got along very well. We agreed on rather a lot. He said he rather liked critical-based theory, which was nice. We stayed in touch going forward. I even, some time ago, gave him some feedback on a speech he was preparing for a Skildings conference, despite my very low opinion of the Skildings group. But anyway, something clearly changed when he started making ground with Rupert Lowe. Now, you might remember that a while ago, Rupert's made an open public appeal for whistleblowers to come forward with either direct evidence or a descriptive written testimony of anti-white, anti-male discrimination. especially in public institutions. I saw Rupert's appeal and immediately started putting together a comprehensive description of my pretty traumatic experience working in the University of York's Humanities building. Despite reaching out to Restore through the stated channels to present what I'd put together, and using the opportunity to present myself as someone willing and qualified to help going forward, I found myself being surprisingly given gatekeeper answers along the lines of, "Great, thank you for this, that sounds terrible. Well, if we have anything for you, we'll let you know." Only to never hear from them ever again. Now, this really took me by surprise because what I presented to them as, well, you can see for yourself, I've published the details on my Substack, is quite extreme and tells of the social residue that DEI produces. It felt like a bit of a slight. I took it a bit personally, and to be honest, a lot of emotional labour was required for me to write and submit that. So I decided to chase them up by forwarding the details to Charlie, only to never hear from him again, something which persists to this very day. That was back in October. Fast forward to now, and obviously he's been appointed as Restore Britain's campaign director. However, he's also undergone something of a political transformation while he's at it. Now, just to clarify, I wouldn't go as far as saying he's done a complete 180, not at all. He remains as strong a social conservative as he was when I met him. But he never gave me the slightest indication that he was a Christian or a Catholic, not once. Of course, he could well have been concealing that detail for perfectly good reason, because he just didn't want to reveal his faith. Or perhaps he was questioning, as he's entitled to do. I'm questioning myself, but let's just say I'm not the only one to have met Charlie. He's also failed to process this apparent religious conviction that he now has. Thus, you can imagine the nature of my reaction when I heard the words, "To be British, you have to be Christian," come out of his mouth. Not to mention the extraordinary coincidence that both Harrison and Lewis happen to be Catholics as well. Perhaps I'm being a bit cynical and I should give Charlie the benefits of the doubt. I would like to give him the benefits of the doubt. But I'm sorry to say that it doesn't paint a good picture at the moment. Not least because his conversion to Christianity isn't the only radical change to his political identity. Equally surprising for me, and I suppose arguably even more disappointing, is his seeming conversion to the school of Thatcherite economics, which advocates stripping the state back until it only serves militaristic and market creation functions. If you were to cite David Harvey, anyway. Now, one of the main reasons that Charlie and I got on so well when we first met was because we shared a vehement hatred of the socialised habits of modern Tories to treat austerity and economic individualism like a state religion, while being utterly indifferent to the atomising and desocialising effects that it has on people and their communities. With that in mind, you can imagine the scale of my disappointment when, as Rupert was basically doing a Ronald Reagan or Javier Milei impression on one episode of the Restore Britain Substack podcast, more specifically claiming that if he were Prime Minister, he'd administer the largest cuts to state spending in history, leading to an unrelenting attack on welfare and supposedly fake mental health conditions. Charlie and Lewis could be seen just smiling and nodding as if they were on the panel at a Bruges Group conference. Only a year before that, Charlie was courting George Galloway and the Workers' Party of Britain, so you tell me what variables have changed his mind. That's particularly regrettable, because I viewed Charlie in particular as one of the few people in this business, whatever you want to call it, whose talents and sincerity matched his ambition. But right now, all three of them look like grifters to me. That said, I might not have drawn that conclusion at all, and in fact, I'd be far more receptive to their efforts if they came across as the slightest bit humble or down to earth. But they haven't. They're denoting historical necessity, referring to themselves as inevitable repeatedly, as if they're the incarnation of the coming of reason itself, posing in suits and tweeds like some shit boy band that's been in the top 40 for 69 weeks. And from what I've seen, but this is probably the worst part, to be honest, reverting to the same sloppulous dualism as their competitors whenever they come under fire for their lackadaisical approach to anti-Semitism and the British ethnicity question, saying essentially that they're only coming under fire because the establishment is afraid of them, to paraphrase a tweet by Lewis. Sorry, but you don't espouse such a simplistic interpretation with such nonchalance if your motivation is to make Britain a wholesome place to live, work and raise children again, because doing that requires either completely resetting the political culture, which they seem to be embracing and encouraging, by the way, or bringing about a revolution of the kind that Restore's membership would never consent to, not to mention Rupert himself. Look, I'm going to level with you all here. I understand I'm being slightly facetious about the three of them here. I'm just trying to express the scale of my disappointment and how disheartened I am that, given the resources that Rupert and others are providing and what's at stake for the country and the people in the next general election, the three of them have decided to go down this route of forming what looks like a Soloviki for under 30s instead of an intellectually rounded coalition of serious but diverse political thinkers, like what Ben Habib has done with the college at Advance. In fact, Ben Habib would be a great addition to their project. I just wish they would cease trying to make a public example of him. Obviously, not all of them are doing that, but there's a lot of that in the Restore base, which is pretty vile, to be honest. Okay, so weakness 4, the strategy. But this is probably what's going to trip Restore Britain up first if Rupert doesn't get a grip on this soon. And it has to be Rupert that gets a grip on this, because Charlie, Harrison and Lewis only seem to be able to hear the voices echoing from their own walls. The Restore camp has stated consistently that it views itself as a grassroots, bottom-up movement, which is precisely what you would want to hear as an ordinary person who loves Britain and wants to repatriate Britain, but doesn't trust the bureaucracies of Reform or the Tories to follow through with what they're proposing. Restore Britain's approach seems to be that any patriot who wants to join can. They don't seem to have any vetting process, at least to my knowledge anyway. They're constantly churning out updates about their performance in the opinion polls and how many members they have, because they want that image of growth and momentum to continue. Hence the we're inevitable gaslighting, I guess. This is a quintessentially maximalist political strategy. However, there appears to be a contradiction in their position. I'll rephrase that. There appears that strategy appears to contradict their position on the British ethnicity question, which is explicitly and openly exclusive. On social media, Charlie, Lewis and Harrison appear to have unified around the deterministic view that every product of Britishness is a metaphysical emanation of the essential nature of British people. They haven't, of course, put it as esoterically as that, but that's the implication when they double down on the idea that Britain is a direct product of the contributions of British people. I also don't think they realise the deterministic implications either, but I'll leave that for now. I understand that this position is maybe tactical because they want to distance themselves from Reform's magic soil position on the ethnicity question, but I'm afraid their alternative conception of ethnicity is just as shallow. And this shallowness is evident in some of the online campaign materials, such as one that contains the sentence, "You're an Anglo-Saxon, acts like it." That would be fine if the party was named Restore named Restore England, but it isn't. It's Restore Britain. Native Britons of that time were literally being slain and having their villages ransacked by the men wearing those very helmets, which are being associated with Restore Britain in the digital advert / poster. Look, that's not a very good look when you're promoting what's supposed to be a unionist party, to be honest. Of course, it would have been probably prevented if some more senior personnel were overseeing what they were generating and what was being put out. But it happened, and it's made them look a bit silly, to be honest. But to a great extent, however, you can't blame them for getting this wrong, because ethnicity itself is actually quite hard to define. There is a never-ending debate concerning what Britain's soul or essential fabric is, of course, and it's never-ending because there are several angles through which you can understand it. But the one I find the most compelling and philosophically substantive is the view that the soul of a nation and its subsequent character is not something you can coerce into existence. It's the product and the result of some things just being what they are at a certain time and place, and subsequently renewed as they are proven to be useful, desirable, and most importantly, it's a source of social bonding. So Roger Scruton, in my opinion, does the best job of explaining it, other than Hegel, anyway. I won't say his name again, I promise. A nation, and by extension, an ethnicity, is not created by its subjects, at least not directly. Its subjects are merely emanations or participants in that soul and that nation's regeneration. A soul, and by extension, a nation's character, develops and evolves almost autonomously under a set of continuous geographical conditions that evolve gradually within a certain space at a certain time. Restore Britain's conception falls short because it omits the fact that DNA changes over time. It is itself shaped and perpetually transformed by one's social and geographical environment. It is possible, and has been possible since time began, for people from another place to become ethnically something else. But it takes time, a lot of time, and I mean potentially hundreds of years, perhaps even thousands. Not 10 years, not 20 years, hundreds, if not thousands of years. It's not something that can be forced. It's not something that can be legislated. It's not something that can be deduced to civic principles, as the Restore camp correctly says. But it's not something that can be deduced to skin colour or blood and soil either. All of the problems that Western European countries have faced are the result of integration being expected to happen too fast and involving too many people in too little time. And the result of that is that the foreign value spheres, or cultural spheres, that should have been disintegrated through integration, have renewed across generations, expanded, and colonized the pre-existing ones. It is without question a social and moral crime against Europeans who indeed were never asked if this was what they wanted. Obviously, I'm preaching to the choir here. But even with the deportations that are being proposed, the shallow brand of ethno-nationalism that Restore has seemingly adopted without much thought is little more than a racialized version of we the people. Things won't get instantly resolved because of the demographic changes that will result from the deportations, and suggesting that it will is just affirming a causal fallacy, or to be more direct, selling people a lie. I know Restore aren't saying that outright, but I simply haven't seen or heard enough about how they're going to rebuild Britain economically and socially, aside from deportations, budget cuts, repatriating Christianity, getting rid of DEI, and identitarian statements of intent here and there. Speaking of identitarian statements of intent, as any new party would in the first few months of its existence, Restore is trying exceedingly hard to transmit the impression that the enormous membership that it has is very much a united front. But I can tell you for a fact that it's not. Charlie Harrison and Lewis have alienated quite a few Restore members over their public takes on the British ethnicity question, and will split the membership further until they decide upon a more robust conception of British ethnicity to run with than a country is its people. However, I have the suspicion that Restore's ambiguity on this subject might be intentional and with respect to other people who they don't want to alienate, who, by the way, have a very different politics to most of the membership. And this brings me to the final subject that needs to be addressed, which is perhaps the greatest concern overall that I have, and this is Restore's approach to foreign policy with Israel. So I've placed this subject in strategy, as a weakness in strategy, out of concern for the possibility that transmitting certain social signifiers and narratives about Israel, and perhaps Jews generally, may constitute a secret part of Restore's political strategy. I say this because I've noticed almost a systematic likeness among the social media activities of Restore's official spokespeople that involves content drawing metaphysical associations between Israel and evil being retweeted, while content that shows Jews being harassed in London, for example, if not worse, is ignored, seemingly out of preference for making a more general point that had this happened to a non-Jewish white person, the incident would not have been given the same level of attention or political importance. Now, before I say anything else, I should make it clear that I'm emphatically not a so-called Zio-shill. I'm quite well informed about what some Zionists see themselves as working towards, and the extraordinary lengths that some people and lobby groups go to advance what they view as their given prerogative. But I'm more aware than most of the socialized paranoia at the heart of this discourse that prevents many people from even touching this issue. I don't see it as remotely controversial to acknowledge any of this, and considering the manner in which Israel has behaved, both militarily and on the international stage, for some time, I don't believe it's unreasonable to suggest having a more distant relationship with Israel going forward. That said, there is a sizable difference between making political adjustments in response to Israel's activity, which can extend to publicly condemning its activity, and using whatever content you can find to renew the historical canards about Jews being ahistorically and essentially impure or wicked. I worry that this may be an unstated part of Restore's political strategy to appease the neo-Nazi adjacent people on the right who, and there's no easy way of saying this, believe that Britain fought for the wrong side in the Second World War. I cannot stress enough that I really, really hope this is not the case, because people like that, needless to say, are fanatics, not based in the slightest, and their involvement will counteract everything the party practically wants to achieve. However, given that Harrison, Restore's senior fellow, was transparently getting friendly with Martin Sellner back in March, who has a documented history of putting swastika stickers on synagogues, I have to say it isn't looking very good, and does unfortunately substantiate my fear that they're adhering to a certain conception of the friends-enemies distinction. Right. I guess that's it. But before I go, I'll try to summarise my reasons for why I can't support Restore Britain. First, the party needs a cohesive political philosophy to define what the restoration movement is, and it is clear that right now they don't have one. In particular, they haven't explained what sort of revolution they're proposing in the British political system, or what the alternative system would be. The only detail they've included is that they're going to be the ones conducting it. Most of the policies, this is the second point, are fine, believe it or not, but those which are not are very poorly thought out indeed and clash with the messaging. In its current form, the project just looks like heavily clad Thatcherism, which needless to say isn't really an improvement, or it's not a substantive one anyway. Okay, third, the motivations and the moral character of a politician matters. And from personal experience, I fail to see any major difference in character between the people presenting themselves as the only alternative and the establishment they want to replace, except for the fact that they seem to want less palatable people in their movement. I'm not talking about anti-Zionists, by the way. I'm talking about those who identify the Jewish problem as one involving dirty blood. Perhaps what would help Restore in this regard is if they had their own definition of anti-Semitism. The personnel at Restore just seem to have just as weak a conception of British ethnicity as those purporting to being British is just a passport. Having a solid conception is, in short, the key to justifying their policy on remigration and distinguishing themselves from reform. But so far, everyone who has attempted it hasn't achieved that. Not even close. Last of all, serious questions need to be asked about what the official political strategy of Restore Britain is, for the simple reason that if it is what it arguably looks like, there is absolutely no way Rupert Lowe would have signed off on it. That's it. Thank you for watching. I look forward to hearing your feedback, and I will do my best to respond. Goodbye.